Lesson 1, Part 2A, the future active indicative in Greek. We've already seen that Greek has a number of different tenses. We have the aorist active indicative, the imperfect active indicative, pluperfect active indicative, present active indicative, perfect active indicative, future active indicative, and future perfect active indicative. Of course, all these can also show up in the middle and in the passive, but focusing on active to make things a little bit easier here. So far, all the verbs we've learned, present and imperfect, have been formed on what is called the first stem. Each Greek verb actually has 6 stems. We have the progressive, the future, the aorist, the perfect passive, and the aorist and future passive. So what that means is that the root part of the verb, the stem of the verb, can actually change when we're changing into a different verb tense. Now, sometimes that'll just be adding something to the stem, but for a lot of the verbs, it will actually change something in the middle of the stem. So we're going to take a close look at that as we get moving here. But it's important to realize that it's actually a slightly different stem in the middle. That's actually going to be the puzzle piece that makes up the verb tense. We've talked before about how the present active indicative is the first stem plus the primary A endings. Well, the future tense is going to be the second stem plus primary A endings. That's going to be the only difference here. So there are 6 different stems that each of the verbs can have. Both the present and the imperfect tenses are progressive tenses, so they were both formed on the progressive stem. The future active and future middle, but not future passive tense, is formed on the second stem or the future stem. The future stem is different from the progressive stem. The basic idea is that a sigma has been added to the end of the stem. But for a lot of verbs, there are some other slight changes. This part of the lesson is only going to focus on the verbs that follow the main rule, and then you'll learn other rules in the next parts of the lesson. So for a first stem and a second stem, aku from akuo is the first stem. Akous is the second stem. You'll notice the only difference is that a sigma has been added. Apaluo has a first stem of apalu. That's what we add all our endings to. Its second stem is apalus. Pistuo has a first stem of pistu and a second stem of pistus. A little random side note here. The only verbs that actually follow this rule 100% accurately are ones whose first stems end in upsilon. For some reason, those are the only ones that actually properly follow this rule because everything else has some kind of exception going on. So future active indicative looks like this. We have akuso, akuses, akuse, akusamen, akusite, akususi. You'll notice the only difference between this and the present active indicative is the addition of the sigma. This means I will hear, you will hear, he will hear, we will hear, ye will hear, they will hear. Very simple, just add the will. To form the future active indicatives, take the second stem, the one ending with a sigma most of the time, and add the primary A endings, which are the same endings we used for the present active indicative, but they're on the second stem, not the first stem. So summary, Greek verbs have 6 stems. The first stem is used for progressive tenses. The second stem is used for future active indicative and future middle indicative. To form the future active indicative, use the second stem and primary A endings. The endings used in the present active indicative are the primary A endings. Be able to give the second stems for the 3 verbs listed above. And by way of note, the lesson page has flashcards to practice these new stems. So if you scroll down, you'll be able to see those. Future lessons will as well. So always check that if there are new stems to memorize. Oh boy, let me start that sentence over. Future lessons will as well. So always check that if new stems to memorize are taught in a lesson.